Good morning everyone. We've just had a deservedly bracing, indeed rather bleak session. Well, brace yourselves because we've got more bleakness ahead, I'm afraid. We're taking on the subject of war, not just war in Ukraine, but also looking at the wider wars that are either raging or threaten to rage in the world. I'm Alec Russell, the foreign editor of the Financial Times. This is something that's on my mind and my colleagues' mind the whole time. And I can't think of many better people to discuss it with than General Hodges here. You will all know his distinguished military record culminating in his role commanding the US Army in Europe. He now spends a lot of time thinking about, talking about, writing about America and Europe, the war in Ukraine, and more. Ben, I want to start by reading to you a comment from Joseph Borrell, the European Union's chief diplomat. He said just earlier this week that a European war outside Ukraine is no longer a fantasy. I wonder, do you agree with that? And if you do, how do you think that war would start and unfold?
Well, the real news is that people are surprised by that. That this would be shocking news that Mr. Borrell would say that, oh my God, there might actually be a war outside of Ukraine. I think the sooner we wake up and realize that Russia is already at war with us, the better chance we have to prevent it from becoming an expanded kinetic conflict. We have been so naive for so long, in economic terms, diplomatic terms, as well as our own preparations. And I think that what really provokes Putin is not the growth of NATO or anything that we do or say. It's what we don't do and what we don't say. The weakness is what increases the chance of a conflict. It's good, it's very important that Mr. Borrell is speaking as plainly as that, because if you want to have more ammunition, if you want to increase readiness of our armed forces, our political leaders have to put money into it.
So the title of our session is How the West Must Organize Itself. As you've just said, and in fact, as we just heard in the previous panel, politicians are now talking about it, which is a start. But talk, of course, is not enough. So first off, in the short term, given the state of play in Ukraine right now, where you and I have both been quite recently, what must the West do in the short term to push Russia back, or at least restrain it?
Well, the most important contribution that we, the United States, and our allies could make to helping Ukraine and to restraining Russia would be to say we want Ukraine to win. I mean, clear, strategic objective, defeat Russia back to the 1991 sovereign, internationally recognized sovereign borders of Ukraine. That would do more than any shipload of ammunition if we just declared that, because I'm sure that Russia does not have the ability to actually knock Ukraine out of the war. And so they are banking on us quitting. They are banking on us failing to deliver what's needed for Ukraine, and then basically almost winning by default. So if the President of the United States would say it is America's policy, it is our strategic objective that Ukraine wins this war, that would take a lot of the energy out of the Kremlin's efforts. Then obviously, number two, get rid of all these ridiculous excuses about why we can't provide certain kinds of weapons, and provide it because it's our policy that they win. That would address a lot of the problems. President Zelensky said, I don't need US troops, we need ammunition. That's what we should provide. And I don't know how the US Congress can stand by any further, or our administration, by the way. This is not just the fault of the Congress. The administration is failing in many different ways to do what's needed. I mean, saying, well, Ukraine should not target Russian oil and gas infrastructure. Give me a break. The Russians must laugh at us when they hear ridiculous statements like that. But even if you don't want Russia or Ukraine to win, we have a duty to protect innocent people. And so to watch Kharkiv be hit night after night the way Grozny or Mariupol is, I don't know how people can sit on the sidelines and wring their hands and worry about it and not do something.
Talking about sitting on the sidelines, as was mentioned in the earlier panel, Europe has rather appreciated the peace dividend, the post-Cold War peace dividend, and has taken its time in refocusing on the need to bolster its defense budgets and so on. In the, I would argue, nightmarish scenario of America deciding in a possible second Trump term in the Oval Office to cut loose from involvement in Ukraine, do you think Europe could, on its own, do enough to support Ukraine against Russia?
Yes, but it would require a remarkable change in the political will of European elected officials. I mean, if you add together all the economies of the European Union and add UK, it dwarfs whatever Russia could do on their best day. So it's not like there's not enough industrial capacity to make what needs to be done. It's all about what's in here. I mean, back during the Munich Security Conference, I was speaking to a gentleman from the European Defense Agency, and he's like, if we can only find 300,000 rounds of artillery so far, artillery ammunition. A week later, President Pavel says, I just found 800,000. And then a week later, it was 1.5 million rounds. And now the Estonian foreign minister or defense minister says, well, we've located 1 million rounds also. So it's out there. The political will is not out there. Fortunately, President Macron has spoken up and is acting in a very strong, decisive way. UK has been the first country of Western European countries and ahead of the United States on delivering things like Storm Shadow. So there is capability there, and you can see the beginning of the political will because I think Europeans are realizing there is unfortunately a terrible possibility that Donald Trump could be our president again, and understandably, our European allies are concerned. Germany will be the biggest loser of all. Germany will be the biggest loser if Russia is successful in Ukraine and keeps going, because there'll be millions more Ukrainian refugees and other Moldovans heading towards the West.
As you know, there are voices in powerful, influential voices in Germany who have long been arguing that a settlement is possibly the way to go. And of course, I mean, in Washington, you can hear that very openly. I spent time a week or more than that, a month ago, talking to people, should we say, close to Trump, and they're talking just totally openly about ending any involvement in Ukraine. What would that mean for the Western order?
Well, first of all, what a graphic display of strategic illiteracy to think that somehow a settlement between Ukraine and Russia will be good for anybody else. That's good for nobody. And I would like to mail a map and some history books to these geniuses that think that we can fix this, we can solve it. Anybody that thinks Russia only wants Crimea has no clue, is totally naive about what Russia really wants, and is unfamiliar with the geography of Europe. And I've discovered, by the way, as an American, my European friends love to hear an American talk about European geography and European history, and I'm pretty sure I know more than about 90% of most Europeans about the actual geography and history. So the Russians, if you have to believe, from hundreds of years of history, not 20 years of Putin, hundreds of years of history, that they only respect strength. And what provokes them is when we're like, and when they hear us talking about, come on, Ukraine, for the sake of peace, let them have Crimea, it is so naive. I live in Germany. I love living in Europe. But you know, the Germans were working on Nord Stream 2 up until the end of 2021. So talk about naivety and unwillingness to be clear-eyed about the threat.
was interested in what you said about your belief that the West shouldn't hold Ukraine back from hitting Russian infrastructure. Of course, the riposte to that is, and certainly you'd hear that from the Biden administration, is, well, yes, obviously we don't want Ukraine to lose this war, we don't want Russia to win this war, but we don't want to have a war between NATO and Russia.
Well, the best way to make sure there's no war between NATO and Russia is that Ukraine defeats Russia. I mean, that will guarantee there is no war between NATO and Russia, because Ukraine is going to be successful and eject Russia back to the 1991 border. It would be the best investment in military history to provide Ukraine everything they need. I mean, not one American soldier has broken a fingernail in Ukraine. And so we should be helping them defeat Russia. I think that the chance of Russia using a nuclear weapon is extremely close to zero, but yet we are somehow terrified. And it affects every decision that the Biden administration has made, as well as most European governments, that, oh my God, they might use a nuclear weapon. Of course they have thousands of nuclear weapons. Of course they don't care how many innocent people they kill, so you have to take it serious. But really, if you look at where and how they might use a nuclear weapon, I think there's no reason, and I'm not thinking like an American, I'm trying to think like a Russian. There's zero benefit. There are no positive outcomes for them if they use a nuclear weapon. Their best effect of their nuclear weapons is when they don't actually use them, because we all sit around like, oh my God, they might do this, and it stops us from doing things even as simple as providing the 300-kilometer ATACMS or German Taurus. This is 100% because of an irrational fear over Russian use of a nuclear weapon.
The session is also meant to be taking on the wider world. I want to just fan out a bit and to turn the focus to the other looming autocrat, namely President Xi Jinping of China. It's easy to lose sight of the fact, amid the war in Gaza, against the backdrop of this awful, awful war in Ukraine, that there are also mounting tensions in the South China Sea that more even worrying possibly than the state of play in the Taiwan Strait is the situation at the moment between the Philippines and China. If you were being asked into the Pentagon to give a bit of advice on what role the American military should be playing in the Asia Pacific, how would you assess how America is playing its hand and what it should be doing?
Well, of course, 2 or 3 things that have happened in the Indo-Pacific region that are extremely important is a recognition by the administration that we have got to shore up our alliances with friends and partners in the region. You know, the Prime Minister of Japan was in the White House last night, actually for a state dinner. The relationship with Australia, the relationship with South Korea, and with the Philippines, we've repaired that relationship. So the United States, with the biggest defense budget in history, does not have enough capability or capacity to do what needs to be done. So strengthening the relationship is clearly an important part, and doing exercises where you've got those nations in the Pacific, as well as with Britain's Royal Navy working together, that's an important part of deterrence. But I would also say that the Chinese are watching to see what we do in Europe. If they're looking to see, are we serious when we say respect for sovereignty, respect for freedom of navigation, respect for international law, respect for human rights, all these things that are the so-called international rules-based order, they're waiting to see, are we really serious about that? And it is much easier to defend that in Europe than it will be out in the Western Pacific, where the distances are enormous and we don't have the same sort of capabilities that we could bring to bear in Europe. So I think what's happening in Ukraine and how we react there is as much about deterring China as it is about defeating Russia.
Does America, mighty as it still is, have the force and muscle to engage in multiple front wars, to keep supporting Ukraine, to keep supporting Israel as it is, to get involved potentially with Iran at a time when there's growing concern that there could be an Iranian response to the Israeli strike on Damascus the other week, and also potentially to have to face off against China. Is that just too much now for the once dominant power of the world?
Well, we don't have any choice. I mean, we have to. And of course, that's why allies are so important, why NATO is so important. 32 countries committed to each other, and that's being tested by the Russians. It'll be tested by everybody, every adversary. December 41, Japanese invaded or bombed us in Pearl Harbor, destroyed half of our fleet. Churchill comes to Washington for what became known as the Arcadia Conference. And so while nobody in America wanted to get in a war in Europe again, nobody. Huge numbers of people were against it. Churchill comes to Roosevelt, and these two guys agree, while the U.S. Navy is still smoldering in Pearl Harbor, they agree Germany first. They had to defeat Nazi Germany first before they could turn the full power of Great Britain and the United States against Japan. So that strategic priority and that sort of clarity was what enabled Roosevelt to turn to the American people and explain why this was important and why Ford Motor Company was not going to make cars anymore. They were going to help make tanks and so on. And then 1 year later at the Casablanca Conference, Churchill and Roosevelt meet again, and they make another strategic decision: unconditional surrender. Not we want to get to a better negotiating position with Hitler or the Emperor of Japan. It's unconditional surrender. We're going to crush Nazi Germany. We're going to crush the Empire of Japan. So strategic clarity, strategic priority, strategic end state, and that's what enabled us to do what needed to be done. So that's what the Biden administration needs to be doing now, I believe, with the heads of government and state of all of our allies. Priority: defeat Russia first. That deters China, and that isolates Iran, because Iran will have lost their only real ally. That's, I think, thinking strategically. And that also, if we think about all of those, people will be plenty motivated to get defense industry moving in the way it should and to build readiness up to where it needs to be.
The advantage, you could argue, that those four countries that you just mentioned have over America and its traditional allies is that they are autocracies, and they don't have to go to their electorates to come back into office. They can just act by fiat. And I'm sort of glancing at some of the latest figures that have been given out about Russia and its deployments, calling up, I believe, 300,000 more reservists in recent months, firing 5 shells in Ukraine for every one that Ukraine is able to fire back. Does autocracy at time of war not just give them really quite a massive advantage?
Well, if that was true, of course, Nazi Germany would have won the Second World War. I would always pick the side that can come up with stuff like this, that kind of innovation and creativity, that when you unleash the talent of young people and in our industries, is always eventually going to win, assuming there is the political will to do that. I don't think you could fill this room with Russians who actually want to be in Ukraine. And we know that from the history of war, it's a test of logistics, but it's also a test of will. And you will not find many Russians that actually have the will to want to do what's happening now. And so while this is a terrible time for Ukraine because of failure of the West to provide them what they need, I think the will of Ukrainians that are defending their country, the will of people around the world that really want to not live in an autocracy is what will eventually win. But that doesn't just happen. It's not free. It takes really clear-eyed leadership from our elected officials to explain to talk to us as if we were adults and explain, here's what's at stake, this is what it's going to cost, here's the cost of failure, in real plain terms. And I think most people in the US, in Germany, in UK, Poland, et cetera, will say, okay, we'll do that.
Can you explain how it is that this isolationist movement has taken a grip on parts of America? It seemed to those of us who I mean, I started as a journalist in the early 90s and covered what seemed to be at the time a time of sort of great hope after the Cold War, the fall of apartheid and so on. And now America seems to be retreating within itself a bit.
It's embarrassing, for starters. I was a lieutenant in the Army in West Germany in the Cold War, and so this peace dividend, I mean, the whole thing at the end of the Cold War is like, this is great. But I think we were naive in the West. We were not prepared for the collapse of the Soviet Union, and we were naive there. And I can even remember as a young officer thinking, oh, this is great. Everybody's going to be buying Pepsi, and Pizza Hut's going to take over Russia, and it's all just going to be great. And how naive, because, of course, none of the pillars of a democratic society, there were zero institutions in Russia that existed there. And I think to answer your question more specifically now, we have a part of our DNA is isolationist from our history. Right? It's always been there, so that's a part of it. But also, I think we've lost our way in a sense of responsibility, defending liberal democratic values. In fact, in half of America, if you say liberal democratic values, you automatically get put into a category, oh, you're a liberal or you're a Democrat, as opposed to the classical meaning of liberal democratic society. So we can't even have a really good conversation. And of course, we are, because we're not living up to our own talking points, we're very vulnerable to Russian and Chinese disinformation efforts that have, I mean, just the other day, you had two very senior Republican members of Congress, Chairman Turner and Chairman McCall, both came out and said big chunks of the Republican Party are completely infiltrated by Russia. You've got Congresswoman Marjorie Taylor Greene, which represents a unique part of Northwest Georgia, the state of Georgia. I mean, she basically reads Kremlin talking points, as does Tucker Carlson. And they have millions of people that lap this stuff up. So we've got to regain we've got to figure out how to live up to our own talking points. Every family takes their kids to Washington. You go up to the Lincoln Memorial. You walk past the Washington Monument. All these incredible places that most of the people in this room have visited. But the meaning, the significance, and what went into all of that, I think, is lost. Our education system. I mean, there's no other way. I can't ignore the fact that our education system in America is failing in too much of the country as well.
General, talking autocracies, there's a very stern character over there who's flashing up placards at me about time. So I want to loop back to the opening question, how the West must organize itself. If you were the Secretary of State for Defense, and you were told, okay, you have a free hand to do whatever you want to make sure Ukraine wins this war, what are the two things that you would push for? Well,
at the risk of sounding like a scratch record, we'd have to make it very clear with strategic clarity what is our end state. Okay, so getting that part, because all policy flows from strategic objective. If you don't have a clearly defined strategic objective, it's impossible to develop effective policy. We spent 19 of 20 years in Afghanistan without a clear objective. So that's got to be job one. Job two is I would every single day do something to make NATO stronger in our relationship with all of our allies. We got stronger the day Sweden and Finland both joined, by the way, and we will be stronger the day that Ukraine joins NATO. So I will continue to advocate for that. From a material standpoint, which I think maybe is what you're asking, long-range precision strike capability. That's how you defeat mass, which is Russia's only advantage. You defeat mass with precision by destroying headquarters, logistics, and artillery. When you take away that from untrained masses of Russian infantry, they're very easy to defeat, assuming we've provided the ammunition. But long-range precision, and there's a lot of different systems that will do that. And then, of course, air and missile defense. The Russians do not care how many innocent people they kill. They're going to keep doing that. And we in the West need to realize if Russia has made the terrible decision to attack a NATO country, they've also already made the terrible decision to launch missile strikes against civilian infrastructure all over Europe. And we do not have enough air and missile defense capability to protect even our airports and seaports.
General, thank you very much. I said it was going to be quite a bleak session, but there were little glimmers of hope there. You think the West can get its act together and can take on the autocrats?
I would bet on us every single time.
Well, I think we should all give the General a round of applause. Thank you very much.